In this video, we're going to see how to calculate the materials price variance and the materials quantity variance. So the very first thing we want to do is look at the formulas that we'll be using to calculate these. So this diagram here to the left is very helpful. So for all of my examples, I'll be using the diagram format, but as you get more comfortable, you're more than welcome to use just the regular formula format and the shortened formulas seen both in the book and in the PowerPoint, but it's all the same. So here, remember, we talked about breaking down those spending variances between their price variance and their quantity variance. So the price variance is where we compare what was actually paid for the actual quantity to what should have been paid for the actual quantity. So to find these differences, we first take our actual quantity times our actual price, find out what we actually paid, and compare that to our actual quantity times the standard price. So essentially, what was actually paid for our actual quantity versus what should have been paid for the actual quantity. So whenever you find these differences, you always want to find the absolute value of the difference and then label that accordingly, either as favorable or unfavorable. So that's our price variance. Our quantity variance is where we compare what we actually used to what we should have used. So both of these will be using the standard price as the portion that it shares, that it has in common. So we're still going to use that middle portion and see what should have been paid for the actual quantity used, and compare that to what should have been paid for the standard quantity allowed. So again, you're essentially just comparing what we actually used to what we should have used for the actual level of activity. So here, again, standard price is the one that's the same between the two, so they're being compared, the two of them are being compared based on quantity. So an important note to make, when you see standard quantity, SQ, in this chapter, it refers to the standard quantity allowed for the actual level of output or the actual level of activity. So if you're talking about materials, how many pounds of materials should we have used based on standards for the actual level of activity? If you're talking about labor or variable overhead, how many labor hours should we have used for that actual level of activity? So when you compare these two, you're finding that quantity variance. Okay, and taken together, these two add up to our overall spending variance. Now we're going to look at an example. So this is Glacier Peak Outfitters, and it says Glacier Peak Outfitters has the following direct materials standard for the fiber fill in its mountain parka. 0.1 kilograms of fiber fill per parka at $5 per kilogram. So they've given us two things there, both the standard amount, the standard quantity of material that should be used per parka, and the standard cost per kilogram of material. Last month, 210 kilograms of fiber fill were purchased and used to make 2,000 parkas. The materials cost a total of $1,029. So here, the actual output, the actual level of activity is 2,000 parkas. And in terms of materials, we actually used 210 kilograms of material to make those 2,000 parkas. So the actual cost of the actual materials we ended up using was $1,029. So let's find if we use 210 kilograms, let's find out our standard quantity, which is our standard quantity allowed for the actual level of activity. So how many kilograms of fiber fill should we have used making 2,000 parkas? Well, how much do we need to use per parka? Well, the standard is 0.1 kilograms of fiber fill per parka. So if we actually made 2,000 parkas, we need to multiply that by 0.1 kilograms of fiber fill to see that we should have used 200 kilograms of fiber fill to make those 2,000 parkas. Now we're going to take this diagram that we had on the left and we're going to fill it in on the right. So let's see how to fill this in. So remember, when we compare the actual quantity times the actual price to the actual quantity times the standard price, what we're finding is that price variance, in this case the materials price variance. So you want to look at what's common between the two. They both use the actual quantity. How are they different? The one uses actual price and the other uses standard price. And that makes sense because what kind of variance is that calculating? The price variance. So we're only trying to figure out the difference in price. So the actual quantity times actual price should be the easiest one to find because that information should be given to us. We should know how much actual materials we used and what we actually paid for it. So they told us straight up that the cost of the materials we actually ended up using was $1,029. So I worked backwards a bit here just to figure out what that broke down to between the kilograms and the price per kilogram. So they tell us they actually used 210 kilograms. So to find out what they paid per kilogram, we're basically going to take that $1,029 and divide it by the 210 kilograms to see that they actually ended up paying about $4.90 per kilogram. So we have 210 times that 490. So we want to compare that $4.90 to the standard cost, what we should be paying per kilogram, which is that $5 per kilogram. So in the middle here, we're going to take that actual quantity, which is the 210 kilograms, and multiply that by the $5 standard cost per kilogram. When we do 210 times $5, we get $1,050. So to purchase those 210 kilograms, we paid $1,029 when we should have spent $1,050 on the 210 kilograms. That's a difference of $21, but that's actually a favorable price variance, a favorable materials price variance. And how so? Well, we paid 10 cents less per kilogram here than we should have based on those standards. So that is a favorable materials price variance. Now, the overall spending variance isn't just made up of a price variance. It almost always will also have a quantity variance attached to it. The only time that a spending variance will only be due to a quantity or a materials price variance is if one of the two variances is actually zero. But in this case, we already know what the price variance is, so let's see what the quantity variance is. So remember, with the materials quantity variance, and any quantity variance for that matter, we're trying to compare what was actually used to what should have been used for that actual level of activity. So we already have the middle portion filled out here. Now we're going to compare that to the standard quantity allowed for the actual level of activity times the standard price. So again, what are we comparing here? It's not standard price. It's the actual quantity versus the standard quantity that's being compared to one another. And why do we use standard price here? Because if we're trying to find a quantity variance, we want to just focus on that, the difference in quantity. So we use standard price to hone in just on the difference in quantities. So we actually used 210 kilograms where we should have used 200 kilograms. We found that SQ up above, right? Because remember, they said we should be using 0.1 kilograms of fiber fill per parka, and we made 2,000 of them. So that comes out to 200 kilograms of fiber fill that should have been used. So it looks like here we used 10 kilograms more than what we should have. So we're going to multiply those 210 kilograms by the standard price of 5 to get 1,050. And we're going to multiply the standard quantity of 200 kilograms times that standard price of $5 to get $1,000. So when comparing actual quantity to standard quantity, using those standard prices, we can see here there's a $50 difference. And this is going to be an unfavorable $50 materials quantity variance. And why is that? Well, here, when we're talking about a quantity variance, we used more than what we should have. So anytime you use more of something than you should have, that leads to an unfavorable quantity variance. Now, these two variances, however, will add up to the overall spending variance. So when you take a $50 unfavorable variance and combine it with a $21 favorable variance, we're left with $29. It's almost just like combining negatives and positives when you're adding or subtracting positive and negative numbers together. So if you take that 50 minus the 21, so you can think of this that $21 of that $50 unfavorable variance is being consumed by that favorable portion. So you're still left with $29 of unfavorable variance left over. So although we had a $21 favorable price variance, that was kind of consumed in full by that unfavorable quantity variance. So that smaller that smaller favorable materials price variance was overshadowed by that unfavorable materials quantity variance. So combined, we're left with an unfavorable spending variance of $29 here. Now, this kind of diagram will work perfectly for the materials price and materials quantity variances, just as is when you have a situation where the materials purchased is the same as the materials used. So here, everything that they purchased, all 210 kilograms that they purchased, was used. So the amount purchased equals the amount used. So then this diagram as is would work perfectly. In the next example, we'll see how it would look slightly different when the amount purchased varies from the amount actually used. All right, so let's just take a look at who's responsible for these kinds of variances. So the materials price variance, for the most part, just generally speaking, the materials price variance will be the responsibility of the purchasing manager. So that person responsible with purchasing materials. They're the ones that are responsible for keeping an eye on prices and making sure that the company isn't paying too much. So they're the ones that would be responsible for this price variance here. Now, who would be responsible for the quantity variance? Well, generally speaking, right out of the gate, that should be the production manager. So that person should be the one in charge of the quantity variance, because the person in charge of production, they are the ones that have a hand on how much material is actually used in the production of product. So if too much product is being used, they're the ones that would usually be responsible for any quantity variances for the period. Now, is that to say that a price variance or quantity variance is always going to be the result of any one of those managers' actions? Not necessarily. So a price variance, let's say, for example, you see a really, really large favorable price variance. On the surface, that might look like a really great thing. But what if that means that the purchasing manager actually decided this next period, in order to show a good price variance, that they were going to pay or they were going to buy really cheap materials? Well, if a purchasing manager is buying cheaper materials of lower quality for a cheaper price, that is likely to lead to the production manager having to use more product because of the lower quality. So although there might be a favorable price variance, that might lead to an unfavorable quantity variance if the production manager is having to use more of the materials because they are lower quality. Not to say that's what happened here, but that's just a good point to make, just to illustrate the fact that although the purchasing manager is in charge of the price variance and the production manager is in charge of the quantity variance, it's not necessarily always going to be their fault when there's a given variance in place there. It might be the other manager's fault actually because of their actions. But that's just a little example of how you're always going to have to dig a little bit deeper. You don't necessarily stop here once you know what those variances are. At this point, managers will have to go and investigate a little bit deeper to see why did those variances arise. And that's where they will go talk to those other managers and figure out what happened.